welcome back to another episode of the Coffee, Commerce, and Catechesis podcast. Join us on our journey to learn more about the Christian faith and how we can live it out in our modern world. Genetic engineering may sound like a promising field with the capability to eliminate our susceptibility to disease and so on, but is it really all that it promises to be? That's what we're going to discuss with our friend Stephen Umbrello today. Over to you, Travis.
Thanks, Rigel. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in for another episode of Coffee, Commerce, and Catechesis. As Rigel mentioned, we're discussing genetic engineering and reproductive ethics, and we're joined by our friend, Stephen Umbrello. He is a Canadian like us. In honor of his appearance on the podcast again, I've got a giant Tim Hortons coffee just to be adequately caffeinated. Genetic engineering and reproductive ethics. To frame the conversation, we're going to draw on a passage from a recent article that Stephen published in Word on Fire, and we'll link that in the show notes. But from the article, Stephen wrote as follows: Parents play a pivotal role in shaping the future through their reproductive choices. Within the context of Catholic doctrine, it is essential to emphasize the sanctity and dignity of human life from conception to natural death. Parents should be encouraged to reflect deeply on their motivations for considering any genetic interventions, ensuring that their decisions uphold the inherent worth of every human being as created in the image of God. Rather than focusing on selecting specific genetic traits, parents should consider the broader ethical implications and the potential societal impacts of their choices. So that's from the article. Find it in the show notes. By way of background, Stephen Umbrello earned a bachelor's degree in philosophy of science and technology at the University of Toronto, a master's degree in epistemology, ethics, and mind at the University of Edinburgh, a master's degree in science and technology studies at York University, and a PhD focused on the ethics and design of military artificial intelligence at the Northwestern Italian Philosophy Consortium. He is the managing director at the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies and a research fellow at the University of Turin. Stephen, thanks for joining us again.
Thank you for inviting me again, guys.
Awesome. So maybe before we dive into complicated parts in the realm of genetic engineering and reproductive ethics, we should probably understand the terms we're using, define the terms. So, keeping it high level for non-science folks like Rigel and I, when we say genetic engineering and reproductive ethics, what are we actually talking about?
So genetic engineering is kind of an umbrella term, and if we want to keep it a little high level, I think that's probably the level that we should keep it at. It's a series of technologies. Probably the most famous one, and we've seen in recent years, is CRISPR-Cas9, which allows modification directly at the cellular level in order to influence genes, the DNA of certain organic compounds. It could be organisms like humans, or it could be something as simple as single cells, in order for them to express different traits. It's not exactly that, but I think that's probably the best way to describe what genetic engineering is. We're intervening at the genetic level at some sort of biological organism in order for it to do or show something different than what it already does.
So as an addition to that question, Stephen, one of the things that we're talking about on this episode is CRISPR, which stands for Clustered Regularly Interspaced Short Palindromic Repeats, which most of our audience will not understand. But as I understand it, it's helped us to radically lower the cost of actually reading and editing our DNA. Is that accurate?
Yeah, so the system is based on natural defense mechanisms. They're targeted to change the DNA of living organisms, like I already mentioned. And it's used by bacteria to protect themselves from viruses. So it uses the enzyme called Cas9 or other similar enzymes. And they act kind of like scissors, like molecular scissors, to cut DNA at very, very specific locations. And then the custom-made RNA sequences that matches the DNA sequence that you want to edit. So this guide RNA directs the Cas9 enzyme, right? That's the important part, to the exact spot in the DNA strand. And then once you directly guided that RNA, the Cas9 cuts the DNA at the location that you want it to cut. Then after the DNA is cut, the cell's natural repair mechanisms kick in, and that allows the person intervening. So it's called the scientist, because usually scientists doing this kind of work, not high school students, but they could if they have they have the right competencies. They could. It's not a very, very difficult technology, and it allows them to either kind of like disable a specific gene or insert new genetic material or even repair mutation. So something that's gone wrong in the DNA.
So, Stephen, you are, your expertise would be in artificial intelligence, but, maybe more broadly, emerging technologies. And certainly when we're looking at things within the realm of genetic engineering, you would have a whole bunch of what we would classify as emerging technologies. So, for you as an AI specialist, what was it that attracted you to thinking about things within the realm of genetic engineering, specifically within the confines of reproductive ethics?
So, like you mentioned at the beginning, I'm not an expert in reproductive ethics. There's a host of people that know far more than I do on the topic. One of the reasons why I wrote the article that I did, and you said you were going to link it in the show notes. It's a popular article. It's for Word on Fire, so it's not a scientific or an academic article. There's many on that topic. There's many books, edited volumes on that topic for those who are more interested in the topic. There's very few from the Catholic perspective, despite the fact that bioethics emerges from a Catholic initiative in order to think about the ethics of biotechnologies, things like bioenhancement, of medical interventions, and so on. One of the main reasons I talk about technologies more broadly, and you can apply this to any technology, it doesn't have to just be genetic engineering, doesn't have to be just reproductive ethics, is the fact that in many cases, the positions that most academics take, they take from an already secular stance, and they take that part for granted. And part of the difficulty for someone who doesn't take that for granted is there's a lot of legwork that has to be done beforehand before you can even respond to those kind of articles. So it's almost assumed when someone like myself, for example, writes an academic article or is responding to another academic in something like reproductive ethics, for example, if we're talking about the ethics of CRISPR-Cas9, we'll just take that as an example. If we take the ethics of CRISPR-Cas9, someone writes an article talking about the benefits of CRISPR-Cas9 from a philosophical point of view, it's taken for granted that me, if I want to respond to them or build on them or criticize them, we start off from like a same starting point, and that is a secular starting point. It's really, really difficult for those who don't start from that starting point to even engage in a conversation like that. So I wanted to just essentially, I guess you would say, start off maybe a slightly different conversation from a slightly different starting point. And yes, it's not an academic article, but it could be, those who are interested could relatively easily develop one based on the kind of the perspectives that I've taken, and maybe I will in the future, I'm not sure. That takes a non-secular starting point to engage in the discussion. And it's almost kind of like the modus operandi in academia to start from that starting point.
Mm-hmm.
So something I want to ask then, Stephen, because as I was reading the article, I almost wondered if it would be better off if people didn't even know that this thing existed. You know what I mean? So when you write the article, it's like, oh, you mean I can genetically engineer my kids? I should look into that, So
you're talking about an information hazard. The fact that it's brought to light is itself an ethical question. Should we even bother talking about this? Because those who otherwise didn't know may be malicious actors. For example, if terrorists, even if the technology exists, if they never heard of it, at least that wouldn't be an open option to them, right?
Right.
To create some sort of bioweapon. There's a whole literature on what's called information hazards.
Interesting. So how do you think about it when you're writing articles like this?
I try to stay away from the techno-deterministic narrative. That's the narrative that technology, and maybe we brought it up in one of the first podcasts where we discussed how there's an underlying presumed narrative. It's assumed once again that technology is inevitable, right? That there's an internal logic to technology that pushes society forward. You can't kill progress. And I try to stay away from those kind of narratives, or at least to not reduce my understanding of technology simply to a techno-deterministic narrative. But like I mentioned in the past, there's always a certain degree of truth to each of these kind of narratives, and that's what lets them stick, right? That's why people like them. And if a technology like CRISPR exists, and it does exist, we can't deny that exists, there is a certain degree of inevitability that sooner or later, maybe even the people we don't want to know about it will come to know about it. All you have to do is just go online and look at a newspaper, and it's there. We can't have an entire information blackout or an entire moratorium even on talking about it. That's very, very difficult. And maybe it's kind of like the Streisand effect. If you try to suppress information, then it'll just backfire, right? And it'll be inflated even more. So you may have the exact opposite effect that you're looking for. If you want to see, usually the censors end up shooting themselves in the foot, right? So that's also something to be careful about.
Interesting.
So before what I was hoping to do, Stephen, is there's a couple little snippets from the article that I think are worth chatting about, and
Okay.
so I've highlighted a couple. But before I do that, I want to make it really really simple for the people. Either if English is their second language, because we have a lot of listeners who English is a second language. So when we're using acronyms and stuff, and then scientific terminology, we've probably lost people already.
Total nightmare.
So is it fair to say when we're talking about either the specific technologies or genetic engineering in general, is it fair to say that what we're really talking about in practical terms is people potentially almost being like consumers and trying to craft what they want future human beings to be, whether it be things like eye color, stuff like that? Like, is that really what we're talking about?
That's usually where the discussion goes to,
Okay.
but that's not exclusive what we're talking about. And I think that most scientists working today with something like CRISPR-Cas9, that's just one of the technologies, are not exclusively working on that. In fact, I would say that they're not even mainly working on that.
Okay.
They're usually working on understanding viruses, on trying to therapeutic uses of CRISPR-Cas9, so on repairing damaged DNA that would otherwise manifest in some sort of disease or malady. Right, so I think that the motive behind current research is mostly therapeutic. Right, so you have that therapeutic and enhancement distinction. So it's or the elective. The elective. This is right. I don't need this, but I want this, rather than that I just need this. That's the therapeutic, right? So the thing of, like, for example, choosing eye color, or perhaps choosing the kind of genotypes that would manifest in a phenotype like strength or height, right, or hair color. You could just imagine. I don't really have to describe too much to imagine what maybe some groups of people may want to use this kind of technology for.
Yeah.
Then what's the difference? Do you want to create some sort of technological apartheid after? For example, do we even have the right not to use a technology, right? In the sense that if everyone starts using a certain technology like that in order to increase their children's height, physical strength, maybe mental abilities, intelligence, short-term, long-term memory, their ability to solve problems, you put those who don't decide to use that technology at a severe disadvantage, and you can't necessarily choose once you're already born what your parents didn't do.
Right.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So it's, no, I don't want to use this technology. Well, are you condemning now your children to being left behind?
Yeah.
Essentially, right? Creating a sort of de facto technological apartheid between two classes of people. These have been discussions for a very, very long time within the ethics of genetic engineering, within the discussions on enhancement, right? Because there's the distinction between therapeutic uses and enhancement or elective uses of these kinds of technologies.
It's easy to see how you could go full dystopian if you worried too much about the potential downsides of the technologies. It's very clear to see the obvious potential upsides. Whether it is understanding diseases and the transmission thereof and everything, but also it's easy to see how this could go dystopian. So maybe rather than focusing on either extreme, we'll try to keep the conversation a little higher level. And I wanted to pull up a passage or a short clip here from your article, Stephen, and get your thoughts on it. So you wrote the following: modern technologies offer unprecedented potential to alter human biology. However, decisions regarding their use should not be driven solely by the basic good of satisfying individual desires, such as selecting for desired traits, or even the societal good of preventing diseases. Instead, they should be guided by the higher good of value, which considers the broader implications for human dignity and the common good. So within that passage, there's a lot of like good Catholic words that, a good example like the common good or human dignity. Those tend to be words that Catholic Christians use with significant more frequency than non-Catholic Christians, and certainly non-Christians in general. So maybe could you walk us through a little bit when you use the term good of value and the common good? What are we actually referring to when you think about things like that?
Okay, so in the article and in my work more broadly, when I start to bring theology into the works, I tend to draw on the Canadian Jesuit Bernard Lonergan and his work, who I consider to be a genius of the 20th century, although perhaps a relatively unknown genius because of the density and complexity of his work, which even for myself was really fatiguing in order to get through. But if you manage to even get a slight insight from his work, you realize the richness and the depth of the knowledge that you could find in there. So before we can get into what is the common good, if we want to call it that, or the good of value, we have the goods come in a hierarchy, right? So Lonergan describes three essential levels of the good, or what the good or goods are. So the lowest level is particular goods, things like immediate desires or needs. So if this focuses on satisfying those immediate needs, which are often driven by personal preferences or the benefits that I can get from doing that thing or gaining that thing, right? In the context of something like reproductive ethics, this could be, for example, using CRISPR to select for traits in a child, like we mentioned already, things like height, intelligence, physical abilities, purely for the satisfaction or the benefit of the parents, not for the good of the other, right? I'm going to make my child in my own image, maybe, right? Or what I wish I looked like, right? Or what I think society would gain more from, or what I think they would gain more from if they had this in society, right? So somehow it's always incurvatus in se. It's a little bit it's selfish, right? It's egoistic. It's somehow you manage to turn what seems like something for someone else, but for yourself, right? But these are necessary. So the decisions made at this level, I think, prioritize the individual or at most maybe familial desires without necessarily considering the broader implications, right? In many cases, this is kind of like pushes us into the higher levels of the good. So we start there, right? But then we have the good of order, societal structures. These are things that go beyond personal satisfaction, right? This considers the broader social context where individual actions are seen within the framework of social structures, the relationships that we build. It recognizes that individual choices are like those involving genetic modifications impact the wider community, not just me. So, for example, you use CRISPR to prevent hereditary diseases, can be viewed as aligning with societal goals of reducing suffering, improving public health. It's not just about reducing the potential malady of the person or something that may go to me, but entire society, because things that are hereditary pass down. But still, the decisions at this level should still account for how these technologies might affect, for example, the access to the technologies. Are they only for the rich because they're very expensive for R&D? Could it create the potential for new forms of inequality? Like I mentioned, that kind of technological apartheid. Even if it is very accessible, if I choose not to use it, I'm making a choice not just for me, or maybe not even primarily for me, but the future of my children and their children who are not enhanced, right? But it doesn't stop there, right? These infrastructures create the basis for a well-functioning society. So you have the particular goods of subsidiarity, right? So just me looking at myself or my family. Then you have the good of order, which are the societal structures. But then you have something that goes way beyond that, and you have the good of value, right? And this is linked to moral conversion, enhancing human dignity. This is the highest level of the good. It's fully realized through moral conversion. So it's a profound shift in values and priorities. It transcends those personal gains and considers what genuinely enhances human dignity and the common good. So not just the good for me, but me willing the good of others for their own sake. That's the common good. And I think that this perspective, I guess, or this level of the good urges, I think, decision makers, so policymakers, politicians, technologists, to evaluate reproductive technologies like CRISPR, not just for their immediate benefit and not even just for their social utility, but beyond that, for their alignment with their deeper ethical commitments, respect for human life, the dignity of the person, the long-term impact on humanity as a whole. We're probably pretty good at looking at short-term impacts tomorrow, maybe today, but how about in 100, 500 years from now, right? So the decisions guided by the good of value, I think, prioritize holistic flourishing of both the individuals and the communities. And that ensures that technological advancements like CRISPR respect the intrinsic worth of every human being. So willing that good of the other as other.
So, Stephen, like I have to ask if Catholics should even be concerned with with this technology, because is it even relevant? Meaning, is does the gene editing happen like in vitro? Can it happen, through natural birth? Like how does that actually work?
Okay, so there's I probably didn't mention it in the article, or probably I did. It's been a while now. There was the famous, or what's become infamous example of what happened in China,
Yes.
where the Chinese scientist whose name escapes me now, and I believe was legally punished in China, if not imprisoned, for the fact that he experimented on what were eventually two children, right? So when we're looking at the biological level, there are various ways that it could be used, and then there's the ways that it is used. Right now, it's still relatively elementary, and it's prohibited for us to do widespread gene modification, right? So I think that Catholics and others concerned with ethical and moral implications, I think, should approach technologies like CRISPR with, I would say, at least a healthy caution. So CRISPR, other genetic technologies have the potential, you guys already mentioned, to offer significant medical benefits. You can potentially cure genetic disorders or even prevent diseases. But I think that for Catholics in particular, there probably are several reasons why they should be concerned. So I think the first and foremost, particularly with the release of Dignitas Infinita, is that the respect for human dignity. So in Catholic teaching, we know, emphasizes that every person is created in the Imago Dei and possesses intrinsic dignity from conception to natural death. Technologies like CRISPR that modify the human genome, especially at the embryonic stage, I think obviously raises concerns about altering the fundamental nature of what it means to be human, and could potentially undermine, if not does undermine, the inherent dignity bestowed by God, extending the human lifespan, right, beyond therapeutic use, so enhancing, right? And then obviously the experimenting at the embryonic stage, right? Then there's obviously the commodification of human life, right? So we already discussed a little bit about the kind of traits that maybe parents want their children to manifest. So I think that would lead to a certain type of commodification where these traits or these characteristics are selected based on, personal preferences or even societal preferences. Right? We can imagine what would have happened if such a technology was around in the 1930s, for example, right?
Yeah.
So you could turn procreation into a process of designing children. It's no longer procreation, but it's designing, like the way we would treat, exactly, right? Designer babies, right? And I think this conflicts with the Catholic view that life is a gift from God, not a product to be customized, right? It's not a Build-A-Bear, right? But it could easily turn into something like that if the technology is functional, accessible, and that means that I can access it not only like physically, logistically, but even in terms of cost, right? Like I mentioned, if it was around within maybe the 30s, things like eugenics, inequality, right? So it could be used for enhancing intelligence, appearance, athletic ability, imagine sports, for example. And that raises similar concerns that people have raised against eugenics. And there's actually within the literature on human enhancement, the term eugenics people are trying to rehabilitate the term eugenics because there's a negative connotation attached to eugenics, and perhaps should be, but they're trying to rehabilitate the term as being more of a neutral term that could be used towards negative ends or things like positive moral enhancement, for example. But I think that these could easily lead to inequality, discrimination, where certain traits are definitely valued over others. And I think that would contradict a bit of the church's teaching on the equal value of all human beings when you're able to design them to that degree. But there's also unintended consequences, and this goes for all technologies. Those unforeseen consequences, but also unforeseeable consequences. Where we're not God ourselves, so we can't see directly into the future. We can predict certain things. This could go wrong, but then there are things that we simply cannot see that would go wrong, right? So modifying genes could have these kind of unforeseen and potentially harmful effects on individuals and future generations, because genes are complex systems, and complex systems, if you touch one thing, could have unforeseen or unforeseeable collateral effects, right? And obviously, our tradition urges prudence and humility, recognizing the limits of our knowledge, of our intelligence, the importance of not overstepping moral boundaries, particularly when it comes to human life. And something like this, there's a lot of unforeseen and unforeseeable consequences, both short-term, medium-term, and long-term, right?
And I just want to give a quick example of that from your article, Stephen. You mentioned that the experiment that happened in China, the gene that was edited was intended to remove the susceptibility to the HIV virus. But what happens is that gene is also responsible for some brain function, I believe. So inadvertently, removing or editing that gene can actually affect the child's memory and intelligence. And so this is part of my question, because I have epilepsy, a form that is with me throughout life, and the doctors don't really know why I have it. It's called juvenile myoclonic epilepsy, and they understand how epilepsy works, but they don't really understand how it came to be. Like there's no deformation in the brain or anything like that. So even in the brain, and even in things that we live with on a daily basis, we haven't fully understood it. How deep is our understanding of genetics? Like, do we know for a fact that if we edit X, Y, and Z gene, that it will have X, Y, and Z effects?
No, because the brain is the most complex object in the entire universe. The human brain is the most complex object in the entire universe, and that it's fundamentally, inextricably connected to the human body. Any change to the human body has unforeseen and unforeseeable consequences. So no, the answer is no, and it would be intellectual arrogance to say otherwise, right? And that falls into even theological concerns, right? So, Catholic teaching emphasizes humans are stewards of creations, not masters of creations, right? And cautions against technological interventions that seek to fundamentally alter human nature or assume control over the essence of life, right? And I think I think that our tradition would probably push for more robust ethical oversight, a commitment towards the common good, not only the particular good. Whenever we hear about something is good, we should try to place it. Is this a particular good? Is this a good of order, or is this a good of value, right? And is there something, if it's one of the higher levels, is there something that's undergirding it? Is there a lower level one that's coherent with the higher level one, right? So I think that maybe the Catholic perspective would call for ethical oversight, a commitment to the common good, the good of value, right? The development, when we're talking about the development and particularly the application of these new kinds of technology, because if we develop it, it will one way or another be applied, right? Maybe the establishment of ethical guidelines, very rigorous review boards from different moral, religious perspectives, that the decisions about the design and application of things like CRISPR aren't made solely on the basis of scientific capability. Just because we can, that means we should, right? Or solely on the basis of market demand, right? Lonergan says neither communism, neither socialism nor capitalism is neither food nor drink, right? That's not an end in and of itself, right? So we shouldn't let things like scientific capability, our ability to master certain techniques, or the market demand to be God in and of itself, right? To be what the beginning, the alpha and omega of our decisions.
This leads this leads perfectly actually to the next little passage from your article, Stephen, that I want to ask you about. But before I get to that, it's also got me thinking. We're talking about unintended consequences to some extent, and then even unknown unintended consequences. And it makes me think about that famous quote from Donald Rumsfeld, who was under the George W. Bush administration in the United States, Secretary of Defense, who once said, "As we know, there are known knowns. There are things we know we know. We also know there are known unknowns. That is to say, we know there are some things we do not know, but there are also unknown unknowns. The ones we don't know, we don't know." And I think that's kind of tapping into exactly what you're mentioning is even when we figure out a lot of things, a lot of potential consequences, a lot of potential downside of certain modifications we might make or whatever, there will inevitably be things that we don't even know we don't know. And that, I think, is what is in any technology is the really scary thing, because we can't, by definition, we can't account for the things we don't even know we don't know.
That's right. That would be the long-term genetic implications, things on the human genome. In the long term, what does that mean for future generations? Are there any epigenetic or environmental implications? CRISPR doesn't just edit or change DNA. It could have, certainly, it probably will have, complex effects on how genes are expressed. That's the epigenetics, right? And potentially influenced by environmental factors. So the interplay between edited genes and various environments, different climates, diets, exposures, might produce, or probably we could say for certain will produce, unforeseen outcomes that we can't even foresee what those actual outcomes will be, but that there will be outcomes. That's probably the most we could say. There will be outcomes, but we have no idea what they'll look like.
Yeah. So that leads me to this other passage from your article, tapping into like these individual traits and stuff. And so you wrote the concept of the, and in quotes, best baby, which includes not only rectifying genetic anomalies, but also enhancing specific traits, raises fundamental questions about our understanding of human nature and the potential societal implications. For instance, preferences for specific traits may vary widely across cultures, societies, and individuals, potentially leading to new forms of inequality and discrimination. So we've touched on that a little bit so far, and I'll use sort of like an anecdotal story that is kind of comical in my own life, but then I can see, how this would become not comical very quickly. So my wife and I, my wife is pregnant. We're expecting our first child. My wife is Colombian. Everyone in her family is, mestizo, so some combination of Spanish ancestry and indigenous ancestry. And everyone has brown eyes. Everyone in her family has brown eyes. So everyone knows that my wife married a gringo. He has light eyes. And so everyone's like, oh, we might have a baby with light eyes. And so this is like kind of a funny thing in the family. And we talk about it a lot. Oh, maybe we'll have like a little half Colombian baby with green eyes or blue eyes or something like that. And that's kind of funny to think about. But then I realized that, eye color is a trait, a specific trait, and people have preferences for them. Now, that doesn't mean a preference for one over the other is necessarily good or bad, but very quickly I could see how if it became accessible to start selecting those things, any of those things, whether it's eye color, hair color, skin pigmentation, height, whatever it is, the idea of the best baby, as you talk about, becomes kind of a disconcerting thought at the very, very least. So, I don't want to be like needlessly pessimistic, but that raises some fundamental concerns. And you've already hinted on, well, if we go back to the 1930s, like that's less than 100 years ago, and we see some of the stuff that was already being done at that point in time. Is this something that you would be particularly concerned about, this idea of us actually selecting traits, or are we not close enough to that being a viable option with the technology that's available today?
No, we are close enough for the ability of selecting certain traits, things like eye color. The more difficult ones are things like intelligence, because we're not even sure exactly what that means. Or the ability to problem solve, that's far, far more complex, but more phenotypic traits like the more physical traits that we would see. So things like hair color, eye color, maybe even strength. That's a little bit more complex. But I think that there's a few issues there. We've already kind of touched upon them. You brought them up again. There's a devaluation definitely of human diversity, right? So the selection of what is ideal traits, I think, risks devaluing individuals who don't meet those standards. So particularly those whose parents chose not to participate within the use of a technology, or maybe couldn't participate in the use of a technology. They come from a place in the world, or it's something that's limited, at least at the beginning, to a certain country. They may gain an economic, political advantage, geopolitical advantage. We don't know how something like that would go at the economic or political levels, right? So I think that could probably undermine the acceptance and maybe the acceptance of that kind of human diversity, because the people who wouldn't fit into what's the best criteria may be stigmatized, could be that kind of apartheid that I said. But then there's also what constitutes best traits, I think, are obviously very subjective and obviously culturally variable. You've already brought that up. So what one culture or group values is obviously in many cases different from another. And that would lead, and I think that would probably lead to a market-driven approach to human traits that reflect societal biases. So, and that would probably, or may lead to perpetuating those kind of more harmful stereotypes, preferences for skin colors, body types, right? That kind of thing there. But even beyond that, maybe at the more interpersonal level, you have maybe an erosion of the unconditional love that parents have for their children, right? So the concept of best baby could suddenly, in a subtle way, but maybe over the long term, it would become exponential, would shift the nature of parenting from unconditional acceptance of a child to a more transactional mindset where children are, I guess, valued based on their traits rather than their inherent worth, right? And this commodification of human life obviously conflicts with the Catholic view that each child is a unique gift from God, deserving of love and respect, regardless of their genetic makeup, right? Children, I think, even born from these technologies might face potentially pressure to live up to the expectations that are associated with their enhanced traits.
Right.
You have that trait, therefore we expect this from you, not less, right? So they would struggle with perhaps things like self-worth, the feeling that they were designed for a specific purpose, right? Rather than being valued for who they are as individuals, kind of maybe taking away some of their, or at least it would be a social, psychological imposition on their free will, right? Not an actual imposition on their actual free will, but a societal one, right? And obviously that would lead for anyone, psychological stress, questions about their autonomy. What are the limits of my personal freedom here, right? Is it societally constrained? Something like for those who have watched Man of Steel, right? Those who are more familiar with the comic book world, DC, on Krypton, they're designed for a specific purpose for a whole host of historic reasons, right? But then there's also coercive practices, right? So the best baby becomes an ideal. Societal or familial pressure might coerce parents into using genetic enhancements, not out of free choice, but because of their perceived obligations to provide their children with every possible advantage. I see them doing it. Their children are going to be ahead. What am I supposed to do? Do I want my children to be left behind, right? Will there be a generation of children simply left behind? And that could obviously result in a loss of autonomy over their reproductive choice, or even state interferences in how reproduction takes place, right? Will the state only offer it to certain people? Is it accessible? Does it exist within the paradigm of the free market? Will there be an imposition? Because now those who chose, the parents or historic parents, progenitors of children who chose not to engage in the use of technologies, have created a whole generation of people who now can't keep up. Essentially, what does the state do there, or should the state even be involved in that? There's a whole host of potential issues. It's so complex, and like I mentioned even in our first podcast, any complex problem resists simple reductive solutions.
Yeah.
So a couple of things that stood out to me there, Stephen. First is that you mentioned, probably it'll be the richest people that have access to this technology first, because that's just how technology works. As soon as it's commercially viable, it becomes available, which means it's high cost until they figure out a way to reduce the cost of the technology. So there's already some kind of an issue there that increases inequality across the board. If potential enhancements are possible that improve our, let's say, performance as human beings. Another thing that Travis mentioned, and sorry to hop back and forth, are these unknown unknowns. And I think that's going to be true for the vast majority of, let's say, consumers of this technology, because I don't want to go into like conspiracy theory territory here, but like we know that fertility is a huge issue. And there are proponents out there for like controlling the human population. And so let's say that a parent goes in and they're trying to genetically engineer their baby. They don't actually know what's happening with the technology. They go and ask for blue eyes, but you don't actually know what the doctors or scientists are doing. Now, I think the medical system has lost a lot of trust over COVID. There have been like unintended consequences of the vaccines and stuff. It could be very similar with this, and where like you said, if you go back to like the 1930s, it's like, oh, well, it's a person of this race that came in to genetically engineer their babies. Let's make sure that they can't reproduce. Like there could be scary consequences like that, right? But like above all, I think one of the scariest things for me is that we don't know the larger role that genetic variability is playing in human evolution as a whole, right? So God has a plan that involves each of us, but is not centered on any individual. And to be able to see what that plan is basically impossible. But I believe his design is perfect. I'm terrified, honestly, to tamper with it. Like there's just no way to know the consequences.
One of the unknown unknowns is that edits made to the germline, which is changes that are heritable, that's what making changes to the germline are, they carry forward through generations, potentially affecting countless future generations, right? So the long-term effects on human evolution, the ethical implications of making irreversible changes to the human genome are definitely unknown, right? So that's one of the issues. It's like, okay, well, I edited the fetus, this fetus here, which will have maybe I can foresee this effect, but if it's on the germline, that will have an effect on the children of that person there with someone else who may be or may not be also modified, and who knows what the effects are there, and then that multiplies across the subsequent generation, that one after that, and that's obviously exponential. So we have absolutely no idea what that entails.
Stephen, I'm just trying to think about, potential downside, ramifications of this technology and additional technologies that will come, whether it's designer babies or whatever it is. If we go back, say, 70 years ago, I doubt very much people could have predicted that the abortion industry, and we'll call it the abortion industry, would become as big, widespread, and viable as it is today. And now we look at it today, and it is like it's almost beyond comprehension from an economic perspective how much money is poured into the elimination of human lives before those people are born into the world. And we won't delve into abortion as a topic, but I think if you look back at the technologies that made abortions widespread and possible back then, I don't think people could have predicted how widespread it would become. So if we think from that perspective of where this could go once technologies become known, available, economically viable, even for people that aren't rich, and we think decades down the road. Is that, like, I don't want to be dystopian, but I don't know that we have a precedent that we can look to where it's like, no, the worst case scenario doesn't happen. I think the very opposite. I think we can look at scenarios and where technologies became available and then our culture adopted them even more than even people at the time who were pushing for them could have possibly guessed at in their optimistic scenarios. Am I being needlessly pessimistic around this, or is this a valid concern for us to have when we think about genetic engineering and where it could lead us, a couple decades down the road?
So, Rajal already mentioned population control.
Yeah.
This has happened already in the past.
Yeah.
China's one-child policy is a good example of that, right?
Yeah.
So controlling population, fertility through technological or even policy interventions, in most cases, not all cases, it's both together, right? Obviously raises ethical, social, practical issues. Sometimes even totalitarian governments tend to overreach, right? Because that's what defines totalitarians at every level. Very, very difficult to manage a totalitarian system. In many cases, they undermine themselves and they fall under their own weight, right? And I think that these concerns are especially problematic if we start from the Catholic perspective and not a secular perspective.
Yeah.
Like in most the academic literature starts from that. It assumes atheism from the start, right?
Yes.
And they touch obviously on fundamental questions about human rights, dignity, the natural order, the natural law, right? So efforts to control population fertility obviously infringe on individual rights, particularly the rights to make certain reproductive choices. For example, no, I don't want to use that technology, right? I would say that we probably share that right, if we want to call that, to not choose that reproductive choice, because choosing not to choose is a choice, right? So the policies that mandate or curse fertility decisions, like forced sterilizations or restrictive childbearing limits, obviously, I think, violate personal autonomy, bodily integrity, undermining the dignity and freedom of individuals and families, right? Many historical and contemporary population control measures have involved coercive tactics, and these have often targeted obviously vulnerable communities, not strong communities. It's kind of like built within the definition, right? That would be the poor, people with disabilities, right? And they're not only ethically unacceptable, but they also perpetuate that kind of resentment that they already have against the system, right? So perhaps, ensuring informed consent, the concept of informed consent came out of the bioethics literature because look what the Germans were doing in the 30s. That obviously they weren't the subjects weren't consenting to that, right? The population control policies can disrupt traditional cultural and social structures. We obviously don't think about the cultural aspect, but it's obviously very, very important. So, for example, the one child policies or incentives for smaller families can, but do alter family dynamics, obviously. The roles of sexes within the household and within the marketplace, the good of value, because once the particular goods change, the good of order, which are the infrastructures in society, the societal structures, start to match the particular goods, and then the goods of values then start to reflect the particular goods. Right, so the good of value is based on the particular goods of these kind of the incentives for smaller families, right? And everything changes as a consequence. And often this has obviously unintended consequences, such as aging populations, skewed gender ratios in some populations where there's too much of one sex rather than the other, right? But then aggressive fertility control measures obviously can lead to these kinds of demographic imbalances. So this has an impact on a shrinking workforce, right? Because with the aging population, you then have a de facto shrinking workforce, which can then strain economies and the social support system. Italy, where I live right now, is seeing that. We have a huge aging population, a very small workforce. The pension, our national pension program is under a lot of stress, and we're unsure about the sustainability of that pension program, given the large number of people that from one day to another are going into retirement, right? So there's obviously negative economic impacts of a declining population, which can include reduced economic growth, the labor shortages, increased burden on younger generations to support the elderly generations, right? That could be increased contributions to the pension system, for example, right? But then obviously from the Catholic perspective, maybe that's not particularly a Catholic perspective, that's the more secular economic, social perspective, is that fertility and procreation are viewed as natural and sacred aspects of human life. So obviously any attempt to control or manipulate those kind of processes can be seen as conflicting with the divine plan that Rigel mentioned. And the church teaches that human life begins at conception and should be respected from that moment. And thus, any interventions that prevent or end life or could end life are morally problematic at the very least, right? And these kind of population controls obviously lead to eugenics, which I said is trying to be rehabilitated now in the academic literature. So keep an eye out for that, where obviously these traits, groups are deemed more desirable than others. And that will obviously lead to a de facto manifestation of discriminatory practices that aim to reduce maybe births among specific populations, right? That's another way it could be used, which would then perpetuate a certain degree of social injustice against that suppressed group. And that obviously undermines the principle of equality and respect for all human life. So once again, you have that, right? So technologies, I think, like CRISPR, IVF is a type of genetic biotechnology. Other reproductive interventions that could be used for population control or fertility management, I think at the very least, should be approached with caution, not like open arms celebration, right? So the ethical use requires respect for the natural process of procreation. So we start from that. We don't end with that conclusion, right? We start with that. We avoid the commodification of human life. So let's not just use economic benefit or market forces to decide whether we should or shouldn't do something. That's making that is-ought distinction, right? Just because something is doesn't mean it should be, right? And that we ensure that these technologies serve the well-being of individuals in society rather than being used for coercive or even utilitarian ends. This is useful, so let's just do it, right? And that's leaving aside things like maybe ecological concerns that these technologies could even have, right?
Right.
Such like resource scarcity. We already mentioned not everyone can even access these, right? And not everyone in all the parts of the world would even imagine to access these kinds of technologies, right? And these would obviously have impacts on like consumption patterns. And that would go beyond simply focus. If we were to focus simply on limiting population size, this goes even beyond that, right?
Yeah.
On consumption patterns. So
Yeah. So I want maybe to bring us towards the final part of the conversation here, Stephen. I'd love to get some thoughts on, okay, what can we do about this, if anything? And so I'd love to sort of tackle that from two perspectives. The first one will be more of a macro level. And so I'll draw again here upon something that you wrote in the article. And then after that, I would love to turn it to like the micro level, like on an individual basis, what can guys like the three of us, the people we care about, do or not do? But I guess we'll see. But to start there, thinking high level, you wrote in the article as follows: implementing policies that emphasize the common good can help prevent the commodification of human life and ensure that advancements in genetic technologies benefit society as a whole. So that's clearly like we're talking policy stuff. We're talking, government decision making, et cetera. So, maybe expand upon that a little bit. What do you sort of envision here? What should politicians, ordered towards human flourishing, human dignity stuff? What are these sorts of policies and stuff that you would envision people pursuing to ensure this doesn't go full dystopian? That these technologies are used for the common good.
So at the philosophical level, so that's even going beyond the macro level, is we have to, whenever we talk about the good in general, let's try to always remember the three levels of the good, right? So when someone says this is for the common good, are they talking about the good, the particular goods for me or for my family? Are they talking about the good of order, which is the infrastructures and societies that permit kind of like a landscape in which it's possible to even go above that and the good of value, right? A lot of people confuse that. The common good starts at the very least at the good of order. We can never conflate a particular good with the common good. They're in many cases they could be aligned, but in most cases they're in direct opposition because de facto, if I'm thinking about myself, I'm not really thinking about the common good, right? It could be that they're the same thing in the end, but the very fact of it being a particular good means that I'm looking at myself or my immediate surroundings, right? But the particular goods are necessary for the emergence of the common good. So I think at societal, like you said, policy levels, governance, obviously investing in education, particularly for women and girls, because that's strongly linked to reduced fertility rates and improved family health, right? So they're realizing, that type of education empowers those individuals to make what are my available options here, right? Particularly when it comes to these kind of technologies, if they're available to that degree that we kind of hypothetically think that they will arrive to, and it seems that they are arriving to that level, right? There's obviously strengthening social safety nets, so developing support policies that provide economic security for families, parental leave, childcare support, healthcare access, perhaps, right? Reducing the financial pressures that could come in a variety of different forms that's associated with increased fertility, right? Raising more children that can help balance family planning decisions, right? With, I guess you would say, the broader socioeconomic considerations. So that's going from the particular good to the good of order now, right? We're going from family, that's a particular good, to broader societal and economic considerations. So we're making the jump to two different kinds of good there, right? Obviously, when it comes to technology itself, something like CRISPR, very, very robust ethical guidelines, oversight committees that doesn't have the revolving door between industry and government, right? To ensure that these technologies are used responsibly and with the beginning and end goal of respecting the dignity of all individuals, right? Obviously, we don't need to get into it, but there's obviously the problem of sustainable development in terms of how if we're the guardians, if we're the caretakers of the ecological, I guess you could say, landscape in which we inextricably find ourselves, what are the long-term impacts of these technologies, and can we already foresee some of them? and design the technology in order to guide the technology's impacts in one way rather than another, right? So reducing consumption patterns that may lead to ecological degradation rather than solely on limiting population growth, right? But then there's obviously the micro level. So we're going to come a little bit more down to, if we're talking about the principle of subsidiarity, so we're coming down to more the level of the particular goods, right? So obviously promoting family and community engagement, having a good support group, right? The implications of these kind of reproductive choices, not only for the individual, not only for the child that will be born as a consequence of these decisions, but also their impacts on their family and their support communities, right? So you build that supportive environment where these individuals can discuss in an informed way the impacts of their decisions, right? That means also advocating for ethical awareness. So ethical considerations in reproductive technologies, population policies within their communities, their faith groups, their local governance structures. That varies from community to community. There's no one formula for that, right?
Yeah.
Volunteering and support community programs, obviously, that offer education and resources to this kind of reproductive health, the kind of family planning that is involved when these technologies start to get involved. And ensuring these services are accessible to those who need the most, particularly those communities that tend to be underserved, or with an introduction of what would otherwise be a costly technology, how they can better access that technology, right? And this doesn't go only between communities, like at the local level, but even between countries, because obviously there's that kind of dynamic also between the global north and the global south, right? There's also, at the very, very individual level, is trying to foster responsible parenting, right? So there has to be a certain degree of education where parents see that there's an inherent dignity of each child, regardless of their genetic traits or their abilities, right? So you want to try to emphasize the importance of that unconditional love and acceptance, which would then help to counter the social pressures that would conform to that best baby ideal that we discussed, right? So I think that these are some of the particular goods, and maybe we would call them the goods of order.
I think one thing that you're tapping into there, and I think is so important for us Catholics as we think about these issues, is it can be very, very easy for us to feel like a sense of overwhelm, or like a sense of, well, there's nothing I can do. Right, like there's nothing I can do. Like this technology is going to be, brought upon our culture, and like I might not like it, but it's going to be here and whatever. And yeah, I understand that, of course, but we all do, and I think we can look to the Lord of the Rings as a great example of this. Like we all have a part to play. And if you read the Lord of the Rings, the books are better than the movies. Of course, the movies are good, but the books, if you read the books, you very, very clearly get a sense that each of us has a part to play in our own circle of influence, right? And not one of us is probably going to win the war, whatever that is, but we're all going to play a part. And we have to make that choice. And so I think we have to think about that within the confines of our individual lives, especially when it comes to these technologies, whether they're coming fast or decades down the road. When we confront them, we do have our own part to play. And so I'll use a simple example from my own life to make this material for people who are listening and might not realize how we can make these decisions. So when my wife and I were going to the ultrasounds, during my wife's pregnancy here, we're in Canada. I know that abortion is going to be brought up pretty much no matter what. And so what I did, Stephen, you have tattoos, I have tattoos covering my arms, and all my tattoos are explicitly religious. Like you can't look at me when I have a short sleeve shirt and not know I'm a Christian. It's impossible. And so I wore to our ultrasounds t-shirts so that the people there will see what my values are. I might still have to explain it, so that if the topic of abortion is even raised, I will just laugh and I'll like point to my arms and be like, we're Catholics. What are we even talking about here? Now, the easier thing to do in those situations is say nothing, do nothing or whatever, because we know that abortion in our culture is just like a settled issue to some extent. But we as individuals can still say something when we're put in a position to do so. And we kind of have to think about those realities. And so I think when it comes to genetic engineering and reproductive ethics or whatever, yes, we can't probably do much about the policies at a macro level. We can vote, and we ought to, obviously, to towards the politicians that will be making super high level policy decisions for sure. But each of us will engage in conversations in our own social circles with our families, with our friends, with our colleagues and stuff. And so when we find ourselves encountering these things, I think we have to take it seriously and at least be able to speak to it. So as an example, if we get to a point where in my family, if the conversation around our son being born and everyone wants him to have light eyes, well, that's maybe like a cute conversation now, but let's fast forward, like maybe my wife and I are pregnant again, God willing, in the future, and these technologies are such that we could choose if we wanted to just have those light colored eyes. I think it's incumbent upon me, if the conversation comes up in my family, to say, but this child's a gift from God, and like I'm going to accept and love this child no matter what color their eyes are. I at least have to say that, I think. So I don't know, like, Rigel, do you have thoughts around this, like the things that we need to do as individuals as we confront these technologies?
I do. And something that you said actually brought that to mind, because something I think about often is just like medical intervention in general, and how it's being used. Like, let's take, for example, and this is going to sound callous, but I'm just using it to demonstrate a point. There are illnesses that survive, within our species. Let's say diabetes or heart conditions. We have medications and such that intervene and keep those people alive, where in the past they would have passed away and maybe not had a chance to reproduce, thereby not forwarding on those genes, and those genetic defects or weaknesses would have been eliminated. We have kind of fought or cut the legs out from under evolution in terms of that. And I'm not complaining here. Like, I have loved ones who have suffered from these illnesses, and I'm so glad that they're alive. But something similar is, you gave the example of like having colored eyes and stuff. But okay, let's say that, we're a parent and we want the best for our kid, and we know that they're genetically predisposed to some kind of illness. At that point, does it make using this technology okay? I don't know that it is, because if we do say that this child is a gift from God, we should be really willing to accept them as God gives them to us. Now, in our pursuit of reducing suffering for this child, we might make this decision to say, okay, like let's do something about it. But at this point, at least in this stage of the technology, we don't know what unintended consequences it could have and stuff. And so, at least for the time being, I'm at a position where I'm just like, I'm not going to mess with God's plans and His design. Like, I will just let things play out, because I don't know anything that He doesn't know or He doesn't intend. So yeah, I'm not going to try and play God.
So Stephen, I'd love for you to have the last word sort of on this. Like we've just chatted about, our own individual, what we perceive to be our own individual potential contributions to this conversation in our spheres of influence, tiny and insignificant as they are. What are your thoughts on this, or advice for individuals as we confront these technologies, which isn't going away? This is going to continue and will become a bigger part of our lives as Catholics in our secular culture.
It seems that we are kind of thrown within the deep end of what could be described as nothing other than a rapidly evolving landscape of technology. But I think that it's still essential to resist that seductive pull of technological determinism, right? That belief that technology alone shapes our future, it defines our humanity. And instead, I think that we have to reclaim that role as ethical stewards, guided by values that transcend, I think, mere utility and efficiency. We discussed that already. We're not passive recipients of technological change. If we fall into that, then it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. But we are, I think, inevitably, what I've tried to do in my work is show that we are rather active participants in shaping technology and therefore the future, and hopefully a future that honors human dignity and the common good. So technology, of course, powerful, a tool crafted by human hands, human minds, right? Its potential for good and harm lies not only in the technology itself, how it's designed, but also in how we choose to use it. And if our choices are driven by wisdom, compassion, a respect for the inherent dignity and worth of every individual, I think that puts us on a good road. So placing the human person at the center of our decisions, I think then we can harness the promise of innovation without losing sight of what makes us truly human.
Stephen, you mentioned your own work there. I'm going to direct people to check out, of course, the article that we've been chatting about here, which is excellent. But you do a lot of writing, not just for Word on Fire, but other publications as well. And your writing is excellent. You made a joke, which I've used myself multiple times in our last conversation with you, where you have 4 degrees, but you're still an idiot, and which I love, because I think you have a unique ability, and it comes across in your writing to be incredibly knowledgeable about something, but bring it down to a level where non-experts can understand it and be like, oh, okay, I can see how I could apply this in my life. And so to those of you listening, I do encourage you to check out Stephen's work. We're going to put a link to his personal website and the article here in the show notes so you can check it out. And I think we need to encourage people by reading their material and supporting their work like Stephen, because we need people like Stephen in our culture, in our universities, seeing these issues, bringing a Catholic perspective to them.
Exactly.
And we don't have a lot to complain about if we don't encourage the work of people like Stephen, who are doing the things we all need done in our culture. So Stephen, God bless you for your work. We really appreciate it, and appreciate you coming on and chatting with us again about these complicated issues in our culture. To wrap up, Rigel, do you want to lead us in a quick prayer?
Yeah, for sure. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Lord, we thank you for all your many gifts. We thank you for knowledge and for technology. We thank you especially for the laws which you have given us as guiding principles so we can live life to the fullest and as you intended. Help us to live by your laws, because you, our loving Father, always intend what is best for us. We pray today for all doctors, researchers, ethicists, politicians, and investors, that you guide them to make ethically sound decisions around the use of paradigm-shifting technology like CRISPR and gene editing. We pray all this in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Rigel, for the prayer. Thank you again, Stephen, for joining us, sharing your expertise and your wisdom. We hope to have you back again in the future for another conversation. And thank you to all of you who tuned in to another episode of Coffee, Commerce, and Catechesis. Until next time, God bless you.
God bless.